How can we trust the Bible when it condones some pretty horrible things? I'm Jeff. I'm the atheist pastor. I grew up an atheist and became a pastor. And we're dealing with tough questions about the Bible. Just this next Sunday, I'm going to be preaching on Genesis 34. And it's a passage about how the sons of Jacob, these godly people supposedly, go and they lie to the people of Shechem. They force them to get circumcised, and then when they're all in pain, they go and butcher them in cold blood and steal their wives and their children and all their possessions. And in Judges 19, another passage, you've got where there's a Levite who's supposed to be a priest, and he's got a concubine, and he throws her out to a mob in order to be violated all night, and she's killed, and he responds by cutting up her body and sending out the pieces all over Israel. In Abraham, who is the forerunner of Israel, he has slaves and just has multiple wives, and it just seems like the Bible condones slavery and polygamy. And how do you make sense of that? And how do you trust a Bible that contains some horrible things? One of the biggest misunderstandings of the Bible, and especially of the Old Testament, has to do with the difference between prescriptive and descriptive teaching. So prescriptive teaching is like you're writing a prescription. You're saying, do this, like don't do drugs. Descriptive teaching is very different. See, descriptive teaching is when you describe your life, a real life scenario, and you let people make their own conclusion based on the reality of what you've described. So to teach descriptively, it would be like, let me tell you about the time that I did drugs, and let me tell you about what it was like. Let me tell you about the good feelings I got. Let me tell you about the damage that it did to my relationship and my lives later on. And you have a brain. You can make an intelligent decision yourself based on what I've told you. And what's so important to understand about the Old Testament and about much of the Bible is it uses descriptive teaching. It describes events in all their grisly horror. It doesn't hold anything back. And it lets you and I, the reader, read and go, ugh, and make our own decisions based on what we read about, is what we're reading really a good behavior or not? Well, doesn't God condone all of these terrible things in Scripture? You know, it's interesting when you go back and we read the passage itself, and we look for where in this passage does it say, well, God told them to have multiple wives, or God told them to take slaves. It actually isn't there. In fact, there is one place in Scripture where God does specifically command the people of Israel to kill, and it's a very specific instance. Well, what is that, and how could God possibly command that? Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1 to 5, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than yourselves. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them, and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you. Thus you will deal with them. You shall break down their altars, and dash into pieces their pillars, and chop down their Asherim, and burn their carved images with fire. Yikes. Why would God command such a horrible thing? And then when you read the book of Joshua, you see that they actually carried out, that they destroy entire cities, and they kill entire people, and that includes men, women, and even children. Now, fortunately, you and I are removed from the historical realities of the ancient Near East in about 1400 BC. And we don't really understand the reality of the Canaanite civilization and the nations that were mentioned. The two things that archaeologists have learned about the Canaanite civilization that the Bible confirms is that they were involved in Baal worship and Asherah worship. So what's the big deal? Who cares that they worship different gods? Why should God be so uptight about that? Well, the way you worship Baal is you took a molten metal statue of Baal with his hands opened and you superheated it really hot. And then you would put your newborn baby into Baal's hands, and you were supposed to cheer for joy as your baby burned to death. And if you didn't cheer enough, if you weren't happy enough, you had to put your second and your third and your fourth child in Baal's hands until you learned to have no compassion or mercy towards your kids. Now you think about that. What happens to how you feel about the next child? If you have no compassion for your own son or your own daughter, then you're not attached to them. Now the second process was Asherah worship. So what they'd have an Asherah pole, and it was like a house of prostitution. So it was a very popular form of worship in the ancient Near East, that you would go to an Asherah pole and husband and wife would split up, and the wife would go into a male prostitute and the husband would go to a female prostitute. And you would do this day after day, week after week. And so what this did is it cut the bonds of marriage, and it cut husbands loving their wives and wives loving their children. Now, what happens when you grow up in a family where the parents don't love each other, and even more significantly, the parents have no feeling or compassion for their children? Well, psychologists today will tell you you develop a reactive attachment disorder. This is where you lose the ability to form an attachment and value another human being, and you become a sociopath and violent. And the history shows us that the Canaanite people were extremely violent, and this went on for over 400 years as their violence grew. Now just think about Nazi Germany and how violent Nazi Germany became in less than one generation of Adolf Hitler and his teaching, and picture if Nazi Germany had gone on but been even worse for 400 years. And that's what the Canaanite civilization was really like. They were murderous, they were dangerous, they were killing the people around them and killing children. And so that's why it was so serious that God said this needs to be stopped once and for all. You know, in our time, we had to drop an atomic bomb on Japan. We had to fight a massive war against Germany to save the world from their tyranny. This was the massive war in their time that they had to fight to protect the world against the Canaanites. And when we begin to understand the context, and we understand the history, and we understand what was going on in their world, these gruesome things that we read about in Scripture start to make a lot more sense to us. And we realize that God speaks very directly to the realities of a very broken world. See, and this is something that the more we really understand the history, the genre, the context of some of these really difficult passages, the more actually they come alive. And we say, wow, like I didn't know the Bible addressed tough issues like that. For, what if you've been raped? Or what if you were sexually abused? What if you have really suffered in your life? Does God understand the hate and anger and PTSD that you feel? Yeah, actually He does. And it's passages like this that help you to understand that. See, this is where the Bible is so powerful and deep and real. And this is why we can trust it, especially when we understand that the Bible is not condoning these actions. What it's doing is it's describing a world where some pretty horrible stuff happens. And sadly, that's the world that you live in and the world that I live in. And it helps us. How do we process that in such a painful, broken world? I'm Pastor Jeff, and thanks for your time. If you have any other questions or specific passages that you're troubled by, please let me know and we'll make a video about it.